Hey, welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to tackle a really complex and honestly often misunderstood topic, the forensic examination of sexual assault. We're going to trace its journey from a past that was frankly steeped in myth and bias, all the way to the science-driven, survivor-centered approach we have today. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the big forensic question at the heart of it all. Then we're going to dive into some of the really harmful myths that have plagued this field for way too long. After that, we'll get clear on the actual legal definition of rape, walk through what a modern forensic exam looks like, and wrap up by talking about why this whole evolution is just so incredibly vital for justice. So, right at the center of investigating sexual assaults, there's this huge challenge for both medicine and the law, right? How in the world do you find objective evidence when there are often no witnesses? It can feel like one person's word against another's. And you know, the answer to that question? It has changed a lot over time. We've really moved away from a history of these deeply flawed subjective judgments and towards a present that's actually grounded in real, verifiable, scientific proof. Okay, so to really get why the modern approach is such a big deal, we have to look back. We need to confront the really problematic history of how these things were investigated. Let's take a look at some of those outdated and, frankly, unscientific practices from the past. You won't believe this, but back in the day, old medical legal texts had these super elaborate, totally unscientific classifications. Things like moral virginity, true versus false physical virginity, demi-virginity. All of it was an attempt to figure out a person's sexual history just by a physical exam. A practice we now know is completely 100% unreliable. And check this out. This image shows the kind of visual evidence that doctors used to look for. They actually had charts detailing all these different hymen shapes, and each one was supposed to mean something different. We now understand this entire way of thinking is just fundamentally wrong. And just how unreliable was it? I mean, the numbers are pretty stark. Research found that these physical exams were flat out wrong in half of the cases, a 50% error rate. In medicine or law, that's not just useless, it's dangerous. And that brings us to the so-called two-finger test. This was an infamous and, let's be honest, degrading procedure that was standard for decades. It has now been completely discredited, rejected by the World Health Organization, and banned by courts because there is zero scientific evidence behind it. One source even calls the thinking behind it incel logic, not medical science, which, yeah, says it all. Okay, so now that we've hopefully put some of those harmful myths to bed, let's shift gears and look at what actually matters in a court of law. The legal definition of rape is super specific, and spoiler alert, it has absolutely nothing to do with any of those outdated, unscientific ideas. Legally, the standard for rape by penile penetration is something called carnal knowledge, and what that means is simply the slightest penetration of the labia minora by the penis. That's it. Whether the hymen is penetrated or if ejaculation happens, none of that is necessary. It's about the act itself. So for a case to move forward in the legal system, the prosecution really has to address these three things: carnal knowledge, the use of force, and the fact that it was done without valid consent. See how the focus is squarely on the act itself? It's not about the survivor's personal history at all. And the whole idea of consent, that's also very clearly defined in the law, which helps remove a ton of ambiguity. The framework makes it crystal clear that consent has to be given freely and consciously, without any kind of coercion, threat, or fraud. That's what establishes when a sexual act crosses the line into a crime. Okay, so this brings us to the modern forensic exam, which is just a massive leap forward. Today's process is designed from the ground up to prioritize two things: the survivor's well-being and the accurate collection of evidence. Yeah, the modern exam is this really careful, multi-step procedure. It always starts with informed consent, which puts the survivor back in control. It covers everything from their medical history to the actual forensic collection. But the whole time, their health, their autonomy, and their well-being are always the top priorities. And this is just such a critical shift in thinking. Our sources are really clear on this. The doctor's first priority is to provide first aid, treat any injuries, and help with the survivor's anxiety. The person comes first. The forensics come second, always. You know, in the past, they used tools like Woods lamps, which use UV light, as a common way to try and find biological evidence, like semen on someone's skin or their clothes. I mean, that was the technology they had at the time. But of course, science has moved on in a big way. We now know that those lamps just aren't very effective.
Collecting DNA with careful swabbing is a far, far more reliable and sensitive method. It's really become the gold standard in modern forensics.
So, when you pull it all together, what's the big takeaway from this whole transformation? Why does this shift from myth-based ideas to actual science matter so much? Well, this slide right here just perfectly captures the huge paradigm shift we've been talking about. We have moved from a system that was often judgmental and could re-traumatize people to one that seeks objective, scientific truth while also providing compassionate, survivor-centered care. It's a night and day difference. So let's nail down the key takeaways here. Modern forensics understands its own limits. A huge one is that the absence of physical injury does not mean consent was given. A normal exam doesn't confirm or deny an assault. It's basically inconclusive. And a doctor's job is simply to report their medical findings, not to play judge and jury and decide if a rape happened. And this, right here, is the definitive conclusion from our sources, and it's so important it's worth saying again. There is no medical procedure, none, that can accurately determine if a woman, or a man for that matter, is a virgin. It's a clear, final debunking of the myths that have caused so much harm for centuries. So this whole journey from myth to science is a really powerful story of progress. But the work definitely isn't over. It leaves us with a final thought. As science keeps evolving, how can the justice system get better at integrating this new knowledge to make sure outcomes are not only more accurate, but also more humane? It's an ongoing and absolutely vital challenge.